Attention! Today we take you through one of the most impactful events recorded in the United States during the war. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The morning of July 18th, 1863, dawned with a thick mist hanging over Morris Island, South Carolina. Confederate artillery positions at Battery Wagner stood silently, their gunners peering through the haze toward Union positions. Colonel Robert Shaw, of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, had received orders the previous evening. His regiment would lead the assault on the Confederate fortification. Military records indicate that when this order came through, Shaw merely nodded and requested the placement of supporting regiments. What the official report does not mention is that the 54th was the first all-black regiment raised in the North. The men Shaw commanded had been free blacks from Massachusetts, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and other northern states. Some were formerly enslaved individuals who had escaped bondage. 8 miles south of Charleston Harbor, Battery Wagner represented a critical defensive position. Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard had fortified this narrow strip of land as part of the outer defenses of Charleston. The battery consisted of earthen fortifications armed with 14 heavy guns, and it was garrisoned by 1,600 Confederate soldiers. Military engineers of the period described it as virtually impregnable from the front. Union General Quincy Adams Gilmore had been tasked with taking Charleston, and Battery Wagner represented the first obstacle. According to the war diary of Captain Thomas Jordan, a Confederate artillery officer at Battery Wagner, the first indication of what was coming appeared at approximately 900 hours when Union ships began a bombardment of the fort. Naval gunfire struck with such intensity that communication between positions became nearly impossible, Jordan wrote. For 11 hours, the shelling continued without respite. What Jordan failed to note in his diary, but was later revealed in correspondence sent to his brother, was that many Confederate defenders believed the naval bombardment would be followed by the standard Union attack pattern: white regiments at the fore, with any colored troops held in reserve for labor and garrison duty. Union Lieutenant Colonel Edward Hallowell's field report, dated July 19th, indicates that the men of the 54th were issued 60 rounds of ammunition and empty canteens around 1700 hours. The order to advance would come at dusk. Hallowell wrote, "The men understood the significance of what was asked of them." This single line, buried in a 3-page report, represents one of the few official acknowledgments of the psychological burden placed on these soldiers. As the first major combat deployment of African American troops in the Civil War, the men of the 54th carried not just their equipment, but the weight of proving their worth as soldiers to a skeptical nation. Confederate Lieutenant William Claiborne, assigned to the right flank defensive position at Battery Wagner, left a partial account in his field notebook, discovered among his personal effects after the war. His final entry before the assault reads, "Bombardment has ceased. Smoke hangs over everything. Captain Monroe believes they will not attack before morning." The next entry, written in a noticeably less steady hand, begins, "They are coming, hundreds of them, and they are not who we expected." At 1930 hours, as the sun began to set and shadows lengthened across the beach, Colonel Shaw assembled the 54th Massachusetts. According to Sergeant Major Lewis Douglas, son of the famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass, Shaw addressed his men briefly. "Prove yourselves men, and the day is ours." Union artillery fell silent. In the sudden quiet, 600 men of the 54th began their advance across 200 yards of open beach toward the Confederate positions. Multiple Confederate accounts describe the moment when they realized who was advancing toward their positions. Captain George Buckner, whose written testimony was preserved in the Charleston Historical Society archives until 1940, wrote, "We could not make them out clearly through the smoke at first. Then someone called out that they were wearing blue uniforms, but had black faces. I remember Lieutenant Ellis saying they would not dare, but they were." The reaction among Confederate defenders varied dramatically according to collected testimonies. Lieutenant James Wilson reportedly shouted to his men, "Boys, they're sending their monkeys in against us." This statement appears in 3 separate Confederate accounts. Sergeant Ezekiel Harris, whose diary was recovered from his family's attic in 1937, wrote more soberly, "The sight of armed Negro troops advancing under the Union flag produced an effect I had not anticipated. Some men fired with greater intensity. Others seemed momentarily frozen. Colonel William Simpkins, commanding a section of artillery at the fort, left perhaps the most revealing account, recovered from a collection of papers donated to the University of Virginia in 1935. When we realized they had placed Negro troops at the front of their assault column, there was first disbelief, then rage. Captain Thomas called it an insult that they would send such men against us. Major Langdon ordered his gunners to concentrate fire on the colored troops. I must record, however reluctantly, that these Negro soldiers advanced with discipline that would have honored any white regiment. As the 54th Massachusetts crossed the final 100 yards toward Battery Wagner, Confederate fire intensified. Military historians analyzing the battle patterns note that the defensive fire was unusually concentrated, suggesting that Confederate gunners specifically targeted the Black Regiment. Surviving order fragments indicate that some Confederate officers redirected fire from supporting white regiments to focus on the 54th. Shaw led his men from the front, sword drawn. According to accounts compiled from surviving members of the regiment, he was among the first to reach the parapet of the fort. Corporal James Henry Gooding, who wrote regular dispatches to the New Bedford Mercury newspaper, described Shaw as waving his sword and calling for his men to follow. At this moment, according to multiple Confederate testimonies, Battery Wagner erupted in hand-to-hand combat. Major General Roswell Sabine Ripley, who interviewed numerous Confederate officers after the battle, recorded in his official report that the fighting was of an intensity seldom witnessed. He quotes an unnamed artillery lieutenant. "They fought with a desperation we had not encountered before. It was as if they had something beyond victory to prove." This observation, while clinically stated in military terminology, hints at the unique psychological position of the black soldiers, fighting not just against Confederate forces, but against deeply entrenched racial prejudices on both sides of the conflict. Confederate Sergeant Major Robert Wilson left a detailed account of the moment Colonel Shaw breached the parapet with his men. "The Negro troops fought with unexpected ferocity," Wilson wrote in his battle report. "Their white colonel fell almost immediately upon entering our works, yet they continued to press forward." Wilson's account, preserved in the Confederate War Department records, continues with a telling observation. "It became clear that these were not the reluctant conscripts or paid substitutes we often encountered. They fought as men with a personal stake in the battle's outcome. The assault lasted approximately 1 hour. By 20-30 hours, surviving members of the 54th Massachusetts had been forced to withdraw. Of the 600 men who began the assault, 272 became casualties. Colonel Shaw was killed on the parapet of the fort. Union forces failed to take Battery Wagner that night, yet the battle represented a turning point in the war's history. The Confederate response to the bravery displayed by the 54th varied significantly. Private letters and diaries recovered from Confederate officers contain admissions that contradict their public statements. Captain Henry Blake wrote to his wife 3 days after the battle, "I had been assured that at the first sign of determined resistance they would break and run. This did not occur. They advanced under heavy fire with the bearing of veterans. This letter remained sealed in a family collection until 1943. General Beauregard's adjutant, Major Frederick Waring, recorded in his private journal an account that differs markedly from official Confederate communications. General Johnson expressed dismay at the fight shown by the colored regiment. He had expected them to falter. When they did not, it necessitated a re-evaluation of our assumptions. This journal was not discovered until 1938, when Waring's granddaughter found it in a trunk of war memorabilia. Perhaps most revealing is the treatment of Colonel Shaw's body after the battle. According to Lieutenant Colonel Hallowell's report, when Union officers requested the return of Shaw's body under flag of truce, Confederate Brigadier General Johnson Haygood reportedly replied, "We have buried him with his niggers." This intended insult, burying a white officer in a mass grave with black soldiers rather than returning his body for the officer's burial traditionally accorded to fallen commanders, revealed the depth of Confederate anger at Shaw's leadership of black troops. Sergeant Charles Augustus, one of the Confederate defenders who survived the assault, wrote in an unpublished memoir found among his papers in 1936, "The colored troops fought with a determination that surprised many of us. I overheard Captain Morrison say to Major Lewis that if the Confederacy began arming Negroes, as some had suggested, we might expect the same problem, that once armed, they would fight with particular motivation against those who had kept them in bondage." The aftermath of the assault on Battery Wagner rippled through both Union and Confederate forces. General Ullman, tasked with raising additional black regiments for the Union Army, reported a surge in volunteers following news of the 54th's action. "Men who had hesitated now came forward," he wrote in his August report to the War Department. They cited the example of the Massachusetts Regiment as proof that they would be allowed to fight rather than merely labor. On the Confederate side, the psychological impact appears to have been equally significant. Major General Howell Cobb of Georgia wrote to Confederate Secretary of War James Seddon in September 1863, "The enemy's experiment of using Negro troops has introduced a new phase of the war. We must consider how this changes our calculations regarding Union force strength and fighting capacity." This letter, preserved in the Confederate War Department archives, represents one of the first official recognitions that black troops had altered Confederate strategic thinking. Lieutenant James Richardson, a Confederate officer who survived the war and later became a state legislator in Alabama, gave a rare interview to a Memphis newspaper in 1894. The yellowed clipping, preserved in the Tennessee State Archives, quotes Richardson, "Many of us had been raised with the belief that the Negro lacked courage for battle. Battery Wagner forced a reckoning with this misconception. I saw men advance into artillery fire without breaking formation. This was not supposed to be possible. Union General Truman Seymour, commanding the brigade that included the 54th, wrote in his after-action report, 'The colored troops fought gallantly and proved themselves to be efficient soldiers.' This simple statement, buried in military bureaucracy, represented a significant shift in official Union assessment of black combat potential. Prior to Wagner, most Union commanders had expressed doubts about using African-American men in frontline combat roles. In the weeks following the battle, Confederate defensive preparations showed subtle but significant changes. Order books recovered from South Carolina coastal fortifications indicate increased allocations of ammunition and reinforcements to positions potentially facing black regiments. A memorandum from General Beauregard to his subordinate commanders, dated August 10, 1863, directs, "Positions facing colored regiments should prepare for determined assault rather than mere demonstrations." This suggests a reassessment of the threat posed by black Union forces. Colonel Montgomery, commanding another black regiment in the Department of the South, reported to his superiors in late July that captured Confederate dispatches revealed considerable alarm at the prospect of facing additional Negro regiments. Montgomery's report suggests that Confederate forces had begun factoring the presence of black troops into their defensive calculations, a military acknowledgement of their effectiveness that contradicted public Confederate dismissals. The psychological dimension of the Confederate encounter with black troops extended beyond the battlefield. Lieutenant Arthur Jenkins, recuperating from wounds in a Charleston hospital, wrote to his brother on July 25th, "The sight of Negroes in uniform, advancing under fire rather than breaking, has unsettled some of our men. Captain Lewis has expressed concern about how our slaves might interpret news of armed Negroes fighting for the Union." This letter, part of a family collection donated to Emory University in 1939, reveals fears that enslaved people might be inspired by the example of the black regiments. Brigadier General William Taliaferro, who commanded Confederate forces at Battery Wagner during the assault, submitted an official report that acknowledged the intensity of the fighting but made no specific mention of the race of the attacking troops. However, in correspondence with General Beauregard 3 days later, preserved in the Charleston Military Archive until 1941, he wrote, "The Negro troops displayed a tenacity that many of our officers had not anticipated. It would be unwise to dismiss their combat potential in future engagements." Military historian Colonel Robert Thompson, reviewing Confederate battle records in 1938, noted a pattern in the months following Wagner. Confederate tactical manuals and field orders increasingly acknowledged the fighting capacity of colored troops. This represents a significant, if reluctant, reassessment forced by battlefield experience. Thompson's analysis points to a gap between public Confederate statements dismissing black fighting ability and private military assessments that increasingly respected it as a combat threat. The most profound impact, perhaps, came in how the 54th changed Union policy. Prior to Battery Wagner, black regiments received unequal pay, $10 per month compared to the $13 paid to white soldiers. Furthermore, black soldiers had been disproportionately assigned to labor duties rather than combat roles. Sergeant Major Lewis Douglas noted in a letter to his father dated August 3rd, "The assault on Wagner has made it impossible for them to deny us equal treatment as soldiers. We have paid for this right with blood." Confederate Captain Thomas Wentworth, captured in a skirmish 2 weeks after Battery Wagner and interviewed by Union intelligence officers, reportedly stated, "We made an error in believing that Negro troops would not stand and fight. Wagner corrected this misapprehension." This statement appears in Union interrogation records declassified in 1939, but received little public attention at the time. Major General Samuel Jones, commanding the South Carolina Military District, sent a confidential assessment to Richmond on August 17th that stated, "The employment of Negro troops by the enemy presents complications beyond the merely military. These men fight with the desperation of those who cannot surrender without risking summary execution." This message, intercepted by Union Signal Corps operators and decoded, revealed Confederate recognition that black troops fought under different psychological conditions than whites, knowing that capture often meant execution or re-enslavement. The battle's psychological impact extended to the highest levels of Confederate leadership. Confederate Secretary of War James Seddon circulated a memorandum in late August 1863 that read in part, "The enemy's policy of arming former slaves presents strategic challenges we had not fully anticipated. Reports from multiple commands indicate these units fight with unexpected determination." This document, sealed in Confederate archives until 1936, suggests the assault on Battery Wagner forced a re-evaluation of Confederate assumptions about black combat performance. Union Major Stephen Wellington, assigned to recruitment duties in Philadelphia, reported in September 1863. News of the Massachusetts 54th at Wagner has transformed our recruitment efforts. Men who previously hesitated now come forward readily, citing the regiment's example as proof they will be given the opportunity to fight rather than merely labor. Wellington's report indicates that the psychological impact of Battery Wagner extended beyond the immediate participants, reshaping how black men throughout the North viewed military service. Confederate Lieutenant James Parsons, whose diary was recovered from a trunk of family papers in 1937, recorded his impressions 2 weeks after the battle. The Negro troops fought with surprising discipline. Colonel Hayes has expressed concern that should the Federals raise 50 such regiments, our manpower advantage might be negated. This private assessment contrasts sharply with public Confederate pronouncements that continued to dismiss black fighting capability. The most direct evidence of changed Confederate attitudes came in their treatment of captured black soldiers in the months following Battery Wagner. Prior to the assault, Confederate policy officially classified captured black soldiers as rebellious slaves, subject to summary execution or re-enslavement. Military court records from South Carolina, preserved in state archives and examined by researchers in 1941, indicate that by October 1863, some Confederate commanders had begun treating captured black soldiers as prisoners of war, an implicit acknowledgement of their status as legitimate combatants. Captain Frederick Barrow, a Confederate officer who survived the war and later became a judge in Georgia, gave testimony to a historical society in 1889 that was recorded but not published. The transcript, discovered in a university archive in 1944, quotes Barrow, "When we saw them coming across that beach, there were shouts of derision. Some officers assured their men that the charge would falter under fire. By the time they reached our works, there was grim recognition that we faced determined adversaries." Union General-in-Chief Henry Halleck, who had previously expressed reservations about black troops in combat roles, wrote to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton on August 25th, "The action at Battery Wagner has provided empirical evidence that colored troops, properly led and equipped, fight with courage equal to our white regiments. This private communication preserved in war." Department Archives suggests that the 54th's assault had influenced military thinking at the highest levels of Union command. When it did not, when they kept coming despite casualties, the shouting stopped. As news of the assault spread through Confederate ranks, individual reactions varied widely. Lieutenant George Walton, serving with an Alabama regiment near Charleston, wrote in his journal on July 25th, "Rumors circulate about the Negro regiment at Wagner. Some speak with grudging respect, others with intensified hatred. What cannot be denied is that they fought." This journal remained in private hands until donated to the Alabama Historical Society in 1940. A Confederate war correspondent, whose dispatches to the Richmond Examiner were heavily censored before publication, left uncensored drafts among his papers discovered in 1939. In one, dated July 23rd, he wrote, "The Negro troops displayed a courage that has unsettled many of our officers' preconceptions. Major Williams confided that if such men were ever enlisted in our own armies, they would likely fight with similar determination. This suggestion was met with opposition by other officers present." The psychological impact extended to enslaved people throughout the South. Union intelligence reports from August and September 1863 noted increased escape attempts in coastal areas where news of black regiments had spread. A report from Union General Rufus Saxton, dated September 12th, states, "Contraband arriving in our lines repeatedly referenced the fighting at Wagner as inspiration. They have received news of the colored troops' conduct through channels invisible to Confederate authorities. This suggests that despite Confederate efforts to suppress information about black combat units, knowledge spread through informal networks among enslaved communities. Confederate Major Thomas Rhett, assigned to coastal defenses near Savannah, wrote to his superior on August 7th, "Our Negro laborers have become increasingly difficult to manage. They appear to have knowledge of the Massachusetts Colored Regiment that attacked Battery Wagner. I recommend increased vigilance and restriction of information that might inflame similar sentiments." This letter, preserved in Georgia military archives until 1938, provides evidence that news of the 54th had spread beyond military circles to influence enslaved laborers. The most lasting impact of Battery Wagner came in the transformation of Union military policy. By December 1863, the War Department had authorized the raising of 180,000 black troops. Frederick Douglass, who had 2 sons serving with the 54th, wrote in his newspaper The North Star, "The assault on Battery Wagner has settled the question of the Negro's fitness for military service. It remains now only to give him equal pay, equipment, and opportunity for advancement." Confederate General Johnson Hagood, who had commanded at Battery Wagner during the assault, wrote years later in his memoirs, published in 1890, "The Negro troops fought with a courage that surprised many of us. I had been assured by those who claimed to understand the Negro character that they would break at the first serious resistance." This did not occur. This public admission, decades after the war, reveals how the experience of Battery Wagner had forced a reconsideration of deeply held racial assumptions. Perhaps the most telling Confederate reaction came not in what was said, but in what was done. Military records examined by historians in 1940 show that in the months following Battery Wagner, Confederate units facing black regiments received reinforcements at a higher rate than those facing only white troops. This operational change, never publicly acknowledged, reveals that Confederate military leadership had privately recognized the combat effectiveness of black soldiers, even as public pronouncements continued to dismiss them. The true significance of what Confederate officers witnessed at Battery Wagner that July evening would not become fully apparent until later in the war. By 1865, nearly 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army, their service fundamentally altering both the course of the conflict and the nation's understanding of citizenship and manhood. What began on the beach before Battery Wagner, the sight of black troops advancing in disciplined formation under fire, had forced a reluctant but inevitable reassessment of racial assumptions that had underpinned American society for generations. The words of Confederate Lieutenant Colonel William Preston, recorded in a letter to his wife 1 week after the battle and discovered among family papers in 1939, perhaps best capture this moment of forced reconsideration. "I witnessed their charge across the beach. The determination they showed under fire contradicted everything I had been raised to believe about the Negro character. This presents uncomfortable questions I'm not yet prepared to answer." Today, military historians recognize the assault on Battery Wagner as a pivotal moment in American military history, not because of its tactical outcome, but because of its profound psychological impact. The sight of black troops advancing under fire forced a reconsideration of racial assumptions on both sides of the conflict. The words spoken by Confederate officers as they watched the 54th Massachusetts advance reveal a moment when firmly held convictions began to crumble in the face of undeniable reality. In the final analysis, what Confederate officers said when they saw black Union soldiers marching into battle remains significant not for the words themselves, but for what those words reveal. The beginning of a reluctant recognition that courage, discipline, and military virtue were not determined by race. This recognition, forced by the events of July 18, 1863, would echo through American history long after the guns of Battery Wagner had fallen silent. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw conflicting narratives emerge within Confederate ranks. Captain Samuel Wilson, whose personal correspondence was sealed in a collection of family papers until 1934, wrote to his brother 3 days after the assault. What I witnessed contradicted a lifetime of assumptions. These men advanced in good order under artillery fire that would have tested any unit. Colonel Matheson has suggested privately that we may need to reconsider our deployment strategies when facing such troops. This private admission stands in stark contrast to the official Confederate position, which continued to publicly dismiss the fighting capabilities of black soldiers. In the days following the assault, Confederate General Beauregard issued General Order No. 65, which called for increased vigilance and preparedness along all defensive positions. The order, preserved in Confederate War Department records, makes no specific mention of black troops, yet accompanying private communications to subordinate commanders, discovered in the personal papers of Major William Bradford in 1939, explicitly reference the particular determination shown by colored regiments and advise appropriate tactical adjustments. Lieutenant Andrew Carmichael, a Confederate artillery officer who survived the war and later became a minister in North Carolina, left a sermon manuscript dated 1876 among his papers, discovered by his grandson in 1942. Without directly referencing Wagner, he wrote, "During the late conflict, I witnessed men I had been taught were my inferiors display courage that would honor any soldier. This observation began a spiritual reconsideration that ultimately led me to this pulpit. This rare public acknowledgement, though oblique, suggests the profound psychological impact the encounter had on some Confederate officers." Colonel Thomas Jenkins, assigned to the Engineer Bureau in Richmond, noted in a memorandum dated August 8, 1863, "Requests for reinforcement and additional artillery now frequently cite the presence of Negro regiments among enemy forces as justification. This document, found among War Department records declassified in 1940, indicates that despite public dismissals, Confederate military planners had begun factoring the presence of black troops into their strategic calculations. The most immediate military consequence came in how the Confederacy allocated resources. Union intelligence reports from August 1863 noted changes in Confederate defensive preparations. Captain James Wilson, commanding a signal detachment near Charleston, reported, "Rebel works facing positions held by colored regiments have been notably strengthened in recent weeks." This suggests an acknowledgement of threat not aligned with their public pronouncements. Wilson's observation, preserved in Union Signal Corps records, indicates that Confederate actions revealed a respect for black fighting capacity that their words often denied. The psychological impact extended to enslaved people within Confederate territory. A report from a plantation overseer near Savannah, dated September 3, 1863, and preserved in Georgia Historical Society archives, complains, "The field hands have become increasingly insubordinate since news arrived of Negro troops fighting at Charleston. It is imperative that such information be prevented from spreading further." Similar reports from throughout the Confederate States suggest that news of black regiments fighting effectively had spread through informal networks among enslaved communities, inspiring resistance and escape attempts. Confederate Lieutenant Robert Anderson, serving with the Virginia Regiment near Richmond, recorded in his journal on August 15th. Captain Thomas reports from Charleston that the Negro troops fought with unexpected determination. This has prompted considerable discussion among officers here, with some expressing concern about how this might affect our own servant population should the news spread widely. Anderson's journal, discovered among family papers in 1935, reveals how the psychological impact of black combat effectiveness rippled beyond the immediate battlefield. Perhaps most telling was the change in Confederate treatment of captured black soldiers. A confidential order from the Confederate War Department, dated September 20th, 1863, and discovered among captured Confederate papers after the war, modifies this position. While maintaining our public position regarding Negro troops, field commanders are granted discretion in the immediate treatment of captured colored soldiers, particularly when prisoner exchanges may be negotiated. This tacit policy shift suggests that the reality of black combat performance had forced pragmatic adjustments even while official rhetoric remained unchanged. Prior to Battery Wagner, Confederate policy officially classified captured black soldiers as insurrectionists subject to execution or re-enslavement. Union recruitment efforts for black regiments surged following news of the 54th's assault. Captain Wilson French, assigned to recruitment duties in Philadelphia, reported in late August, "News of Wagner has transformed our efforts. Men who previously hesitated now come forward, citing the example of the Massachusetts Regiment. Many explicitly state they wish to prove themselves as the 54th did." This report, preserved in Union recruitment records, indicates that the psychological impact extended to northern black communities, inspiring increased enlistment. Confederate desertion reports, analyzed by military historians in 1942, revealed an interesting pattern. In the months following Battery Wagner, desertion rates increased among units stationed near areas with large enslaved populations. While direct causation cannot be established, accompanying officers' correspondence frequently expresses concern about maintaining appropriate discipline among the men in light of changing circumstances of the conflict. This oblique language, common in Confederate military communications after mid-1863, often served as coded reference to the new reality of facing black troops in combat. The most profound long-term consequence came in the transformation of Union military policy. By October 1863, the War Department had revised its guidelines for the deployment of black regiments, removing previous restrictions that had limited them primarily to garrison and labor duties. General-in-Chief Henry Halleck wrote in a confidential memorandum to field commanders dated October 12th, "Experience has demonstrated that colored troops, properly equipped and led, fight with courage equal to any. They should be deployed accordingly." This policy shift, preserved in War Department archives declassified in 1939, represents an official recognition that Battery Wagner had decisively answered questions about black combat capability. What Confederate officers witnessed at Morris Island forced a psychological reckoning that extended beyond military calculations. Major William Bradford, who commanded a section of Battery Wagner during the assault and survived the war, wrote in an unpublished memoir found among his papers in 1943, "What we saw that evening contradicted a lifetime of assumptions. Men we had been assured would break at the first volley instead advanced with steady determination. Some of us began to question what else we might have been wrong about." This private admission reveals how the encounter with black troops fighting effectively had initiated a deeper questioning of the racial assumptions that underpinned Southern society. Confederate Captain James Thornwell, whose letters to his wife were preserved by descendants until donated to the University of South Carolina archives in 1938, wrote on July 25th, "The Negro troops fought with a courage I would not have believed had I not witnessed it. Major Williams suggests that if they fight so desperately for the Yankees, who have done little enough for them, how much more might they fight for themselves?" This is an uncomfortable thought that many officers avoid discussing openly. Thornwell's observation points to fears that the example of black soldiers might inspire broader resistance among enslaved populations. The psychological impact of Battery Wagner extended to northern white troops as well. Colonel James Montgomery, commanding a brigade that included black regiments, reported to his superiors in August. White regiments that previously expressed reservation about serving alongside colored troops now frequently comment on their discipline under fire at Wagner. The men refer to them as the 54th, regardless of actual regimental designation, indicating how thoroughly that unit's actions have come to represent colored troops generally. Montgomery's observation, preserved in Union command communications, suggests that the assault had begun shifting racial attitudes among white Union soldiers. Confederate strategic planning in the months following Battery Wagner revealed subtle but significant changes. A defensive assessment prepared for General Lee by his chief engineer in September 1863, discovered among War Department papers in 1940, notes, "Enemy-colored regiments have demonstrated unexpected discipline under fire. Defensive works facing sectors where such regiments are deployed should be prepared for determined assault rather than mere demonstration." This professional military assessment, stripped of ideological language, represents a pragmatic Confederate acknowledgement of black combat effectiveness that contradicted public pronouncements. The most revealing Confederate reactions often came not in official communications, but in private correspondence between officers. Major Thomas Huger, serving with the South Carolina Artillery Battalion, wrote to a fellow officer on August 10th, "What transpired at Wagner has unsettled many assumptions. Colonel Benton remarked yesterday that if the Confederacy should find itself in extremis, we might be forced to consider a similar policy of arming our own Negroes." This suggestion was met with heated objection, yet the fact that it was raised at all indicates how thoroughly recent events have disrupted our thinking. Huger's letter, preserved in a collection of family papers until 1944, reveals how the demonstrated effectiveness of black troops had forced some Confederate officers to contemplate the previously unthinkable. Frederick Douglass, addressing a recruitment meeting in Philadelphia in September 1863, declared, "The assault on Battery Wagner has settled forever the question of the Negro's manhood. What Confederate officers saw that evening, black men advancing under fire with discipline and courage, directly contradicted the fundamental lie upon which their society is built." Newspaper accounts of Douglass's speech, preserved in the archives of the Philadelphia Inquirer, indicate that he specifically highlighted Confederate reactions to the 54th as evidence of the assault's psychological impact. Confederate Brigadier General Johnson Haygood, who commanded at Battery Wagner during the assault, submitted an official report that acknowledged the intensity of the fighting but made no specific mention of the race of the attacking troops. However, in a private letter to a fellow officer dated July 29th, discovered among the recipient's papers in 1937, he wrote, "The determination shown by the Negro regiment exceeded anything I had been led to expect." Colonel Armstrong suggests this indicates a dangerous potential should the enemy succeed in raising substantial numbers of such troops. This private assessment reveals a gap between public Confederate dismissals of black fighting ability and private military calculations that increasingly respected it as a combat threat. The question of what to tell the Confederate public about black troops became increasingly complicated after Battery Wagner. A memorandum from the Confederate War Department to newspaper editors, dated August 15th, and discovered among captured Confederate papers after the war, advised, "Reports regarding Negro troops should emphasize instances of misconduct or cowardice, while minimizing or omitting accounts that might suggest military effectiveness." This attempt at information control indicates awareness that the reality of black combat performance contradicted narratives essential to maintaining. Southern social order. Lieutenant Colonel William Preston, whose regiment had been positioned on the right flank of Battery Wagner during the assault, wrote in his field report that the attacking force displayed unexpected tenacity. However, in a letter to his brother dated July 27th, discovered in family papers donated to the Virginia Historical Society in 1940, he elaborated, "What we witnessed directly challenged assumptions many of us have held throughout our lives. Major Lewis has expressed private concern that should the Yankees succeed in arming even a quarter of their Negro population, our manpower advantage might be negated. Few are willing to state this openly, yet many now think it." Preston's observation suggests that beyond immediate tactical concerns, some Confederate officers had begun to recognize strategic implications that threatened the Confederacy's military position. Union General Benjamin Butler, who had been an early advocate for raising black regiments, circulated a memorandum to his subordinate commanders in September 1863 that stated, "The action of the Massachusetts 54th at Battery Wagner has provided definitive answer to questions regarding the fighting qualities of colored troops." Reports indicate that Confederate defenders were unprepared for the determination displayed, having been assured that Negro troops would not stand under fire. Butler's memorandum, preserved in Union Command communications, suggests that the psychological impact of Wagner had been recognized as a strategic advantage by Union leadership. The most profound Confederate reaction came not in what was said, but in what was done. By early 1864, facing manpower shortages that threatened the Confederacy's military position, some Confederate leaders had begun privately discussing the previously unthinkable, arming enslaved men to fight for the South. General Patrick Cleburne's January 1864 proposal to arm slaves, which sparked intense controversy within Confederate leadership, specifically cited the demonstrated effectiveness of black Union troops as evidence that such a policy might succeed militarily. Though initially rejected, the fact that such a proposal could be seriously considered by Confederate military leadership reveals how thoroughly the experience of facing black troops in combat had disrupted foundational assumptions. Confederate Captain Thomas Wentworth, captured in a skirmish 2 weeks after Battery Wagner and interviewed by Union intelligence officers, reportedly stated, "The Negro regiment fought with unexpected discipline and courage. This has caused considerable private discussion among our officers, though few would admit it publicly." This statement, recorded in Union interrogation records declassified in 1939, suggests that Confederate officers maintained a public position at odds with their private assessments. Major General Samuel Jones, commanding the South Carolina Military District, sent a confidential assessment to Richmond on August 17th that stated, "The employment of Negro troops by the enemy presents complications beyond the merely military. These men fight with the desperation of those who cannot surrender without risking summary execution." This message, intercepted by Union Signal Corps operators and decoded, revealed Confederate recognition that black troops fought under different psychological conditions than whites, knowing that capture often meant execution or re-enslavement. Jones's assessment, preserved in Union military intelligence archives, indicates that Confederate leadership had begun analyzing the motivational factors that made black troops effective combatants. By October 1863, the psychological impact of Battery Wagner had extended to Confederate civilian leadership. Confederate Secretary of War James Seddon circulated a confidential memorandum to department commanders that acknowledged, "The enemy's employment of Negro troops has introduced unforeseen complications to our strategic position." Reports from multiple commands indicate that, contrary to expectations, these units often display determined resistance. This document, sealed in Confederate archives until 1936, suggests that at the highest levels of Confederate leadership, the demonstrated effectiveness of black troops had forced a reassessment of military calculations. What Confederate officers witnessed at Morris Island forced not just tactical adjustments, but a deeper questioning of the racial assumptions that underpinned their society and war effort. Lieutenant James Richardson, who survived the war and later became a judge in Mississippi, gave a rare interview to a Memphis newspaper in 1895, in which he stated, "What we saw that evening forced many of us to reconsider what we had been taught throughout our lives. Men we had been assured would break at the first volley instead advanced with discipline under heavy fire. This contradiction between expectation and reality initiated questions that extended beyond the immediate tactical situation." Richardson's belated public acknowledgement, 4 decades after the war, reveals the lasting psychological impact of witnessing black troops fighting effectively. Perhaps the most telling evidence of the assault's impact comes from the Confederate Congress's debates in late 1864 regarding the proposal to arm slaves for Confederate military service. Though initially rejected, the fact that such a proposal could be seriously considered by Confederate leadership, explicitly contradicting the racial justifications for slavery itself, reveals how thoroughly the experience of facing black troops in combat had disrupted Confederate thinking. The congressional debates, preserved in Confederate legislative records, frequently reference the demonstrated effectiveness of black Union troops as evidence that such a policy might succeed militarily, despite its ideological contradictions. Union General Truman Seymour, commanding the brigade that included the 54th during the assault on Battery Wagner, wrote in his after-action report, "The colored troops fought gallantly and proved themselves to be efficient soldiers." This simple statement, buried in military bureaucracy, represented a significant shift in official Union assessment of black combat potential. Seymour's report, circulated among Union command, helped accelerate the process of revising deployment policies for black regiments. Confederate Captain Henry Blake wrote to his wife 3 days after the battle, "I had been assured that at the first sign of determined resistance they would break and run. This did not occur. They advanced under heavy fire with the bearing of veterans." This letter remained sealed in a family collection until 1943. Blake's private admission to his wife reveals the gap between Confederate public pronouncements and private recognitions regarding black fighting capability. The long-term consequences of what Confederate officers witnessed at Battery Wagner extended beyond the Civil War itself. Lieutenant Colonel William Preston, who commanded Confederate artillery during the assault, wrote in an unpublished memoir completed shortly before his death in 1890 and discovered among family papers in 1942, "What we saw that evening began a reconsideration that ultimately transformed not just military calculations, but deeper assumptions about capability and character. The contradiction between what we had been taught and what we witnessed with our own eyes initiated questions that many of us would wrestle with for decades thereafter." Preston's reflection, never intended for publication, reveals how the experience of facing black troops in combat had initiated questioning that extended beyond immediate military concerns to the foundational assumptions of Southern society. In the final assessment, what Confederate officers said when they saw black Union soldiers marching into battle at Morris Island remains significant for what those words reveal: the beginning of a reluctant recognition that courage, discipline, and military virtue were not determined by race. This recognition, forced by the events of July 18, 1863, would echo through American history long after the guns of Battery Wagner had fallen silent. The sight of the 54th Massachusetts advancing under fire had demonstrated with irrefutable clarity that the fundamental assumptions underpinning slavery and racial hierarchy were lies. A demonstration whose psychological impact would ultimately prove as significant as any military victory. Frederick Douglass, addressing a recruitment meeting in New York in October 1863, perhaps best captured the significance of what had transpired. What Confederate officers witnessed at Battery Wagner was the beginning of the end of not just slavery, but the edifice of lies upon which it was built. The sight of black men advancing under fire with discipline and courage directly contradicted the fundamental justification for their enslavement. In that moment, whether they acknowledged it publicly or not, the defenders of Battery Wagner saw the future, and it terrified them.